the most powerful mining magnate in all of Canada, believed he controlled everything within his reach until a quiet, trembling waitress at a Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Toronto did something no one could have predicted. With a few precise movements of her hands, she tore open a devastating family secret that silenced an entire private dining room and shattered a dynasty's carefully constructed lie forever. Ivy Renaud had spent most of her 27 years learning how to disappear. She had a talent for it, the way some people have a talent for playing piano or telling jokes. Ivy could move through a room of 40 guests, carrying a tray of bone china and crystal, without a single patron registering her existence. It was, ironically, what made her invaluable at Aurelia, the 3 Michelin-star establishment nestled on King Street West in Toronto's financial district, where a bottle of wine routinely cost more than Ivy's bi-weekly paycheck, and the clientele expected their service staff to function like well-dressed phantoms. The restaurant hummed with the particular frequency of extreme wealth. Murmured conversations about mergers and vineyard acquisitions blended with the soft clink of Riedel stemware and the distant, careful plating sounds drifting from the open kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of seared foie gras and fresh tarragon, and every surface gleamed under the warm amber glow of hand-blown Murano glass pendants. For most of the servers, Aurelia was a career. For Ivy, it was a tourniquet. 18 months ago, her younger brother Caleb had died. He was 23. He had been born profoundly deaf, and for Ivy, being his older sister had never been a passive role. She had learned American Sign Language before she could properly spell her own name. By the time she was 8, she was interpreting for him at doctor's appointments, at parent-teacher conferences, at the corner store when the cashier got impatient. Caleb was brilliant. He had been accepted into a graduate linguistics program at the University of British Columbia, studying the very language that connected them, and then a rare autoimmune disorder, the kind that moves through a body like wildfire, had put him in Vancouver General 3 times in 1 year. The medical bills arrived like an avalanche. Ivy, who had been halfway through a biochemistry degree at the University of Toronto on a full scholarship, withdrew quietly to pick up a second job, then a third. The scholarship evaporated. Her professors sent regretful emails she never opened. When Caleb died on a Tuesday morning in March, with rain streaking the hospital windows, Ivy stopped speaking almost entirely. Not by conscious decision. The words simply retreated somewhere deep inside her, curling into a space that had once been filled with Caleb's laughter and the fluid sweep of his hands. She could manage the bare minimum required at work. Good evening. The special tonight is the Arctic char. May I clear your plate? Beyond that, conversation felt like swallowing glass. Her manager, a meticulous and perpetually irritated man named Patrick Gilroy, had long since given up on Ivy as a front-of-house asset. He kept her on because she was flawless with logistics, invisible to the guests, and never, ever late. But he made his frustration known regularly. Renaud, you're on water and bread service again tonight. VIP room. Patrick's voice was clipped, barely looking up from his tablet as Ivy tied her apron in the service corridor. The Ashworth party. Private dining. Do not initiate conversation. Do not linger. Do not, under any circumstances, make yourself noticeable. If Dominic Ashworth so much as learns your first name, you're done. Clear? Ivy nodded. She knew the name. Everyone in Canada knew the name. Dominic Ashworth, 40 years old, was the CEO of Ashworth Resource Holdings, a mining and rare earth minerals conglomerate headquartered in Toronto with operations spanning 3 continents. Forbes had profiled him twice. The Globe and Mail called him the most consequential Canadian industrialist of his generation. He was weeks away from closing a transformative merger with a European consortium that would make his company the largest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. He was also, by all public accounts, intensely private, fiercely protective of his family, and not someone who tolerated mistakes. But tonight was not a board meeting. Tonight was personal. Ivy positioned herself at the service station adjacent to the private dining room. A gorgeous, wood-paneled alcove separated from the main floor by frosted glass panels etched with Art Deco motifs. She clutched her silver water pitcher and watched the Ashworth party arrive through the narrow gap where the panels met. Dominic entered first, radiating the particular exhaustion of a man who had been awake since 4 a.m, making decisions that moved markets. He wore a navy suit with no tie, his jaw set in a permanent clench, his eyes already scanning the glowing screen of his phone. Beside him walked his fiancée, Juliette Fontaine. Juliette was a former broadcast journalist turned lifestyle brand founder, the kind of woman whose Instagram following exceeded the population of several maritime provinces. She moved in a cloud of Chanel 5 and calculated warmth, her smile bright and performative, her pale blue Dior gown catching the light with every studied step, and behind them, walking slowly and with visible uncertainty, came an older woman. She was perhaps 70, small-framed, wearing a beautifully cut charcoal wool blazer over a cream blouse. A strand of South Sea pearls rested against her collarbone. Her silver hair was swept into a low chignon. She was elegant in a way that spoke of decades of quiet refinement. But her eyes told a different story entirely. They darted around the opulent room with a mixture of bewilderment and deep, aching isolation, like someone who had been brought to a foreign country without a map. This was Margaret Ashworth, Dominic's mother. As the party settled into the alcove, Ivy began her silent orbit. She poured still water for Juliette, who did not acknowledge her. She refilled Dominic's sparkling water. He did not look up from his phone. She moved to Margaret. Up close, the loneliness in the older woman's face was staggering. Margaret sat perfectly upright, her posture impeccable, but her hands rested on the tablecloth with a subtle, repetitive tension that Ivy recognized instantly, the slight drumming of fingertips, the way her gaze fixed, laser-focused, on the mouths of those speaking, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head, angling her better ear toward the conversation she still could not access. Margaret Ashworth was deaf. The realization hit Ivy like a physical blow, the way recognizing a familiar face in a crowd can knock the breath out of you. She knew those signs the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had watched Caleb navigate a hearing world with that same intense, exhausting vigilance every day of his life. But what Ivy saw next made her blood chill. Simon, the head waiter, was presenting the evening's tasting menu. He stood at Dominic's end of the table, his back partially turned to Margaret, speaking in the low, rapid murmur that Aurelia's staff perfected. Juliette leaned in attentively, asking about wine pairings, laughing at something Simon said about a Burgundy vintage. Margaret tapped the table gently. Once, twice, trying to get Dominic's attention. He didn't notice. She turned toward Juliette, her lips moving slightly, forming a question, and then Juliette did something that made Ivy's stomach lurch. Without missing a beat in her conversation with Simon, Juliette raised her linen napkin to her mouth, dabbing at invisible lipstick. She held the napkin there, casually, elegantly, for a full 15 seconds, turning her body slightly away from Margaret. It was a gesture so smooth, so practiced, that anyone watching would see nothing but a woman attending to her appearance. But Ivy saw it for exactly what it was. Juliette was deliberately covering her lips so Margaret could not read them. The ache that bloomed in Ivy's chest was ancient and familiar. She had seen this cruelty before. The librarian who turned away while speaking to Caleb. the hockey coach who gave instructions while facing the whiteboard, the cousin at Thanksgiving who made jokes about sign language looking like a broken windmill, 1,000 small violences, each one a brick in the wall that separated Caleb from the hearing world. Margaret's hands fell to her lap. She stared at the intricate menu in front of her, clearly overwhelmed by the small French print and the unfamiliar culinary terminology. "Simon," Juliet said, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Dominic is on a call, so I'll order for the table. We'll start with the lobster bisque en croûte. For mains, Dominic and I will share the côte de bœuf for two, bone-in, with the truffle jus." "Excellent selection, Miss Fontaine," Simon replied smoothly. "And for Mrs. Ashworth." Juliet didn't glance at Margaret. Oh, Margaret has had terrible digestive issues lately. Her stomach simply can't handle anything rich. She'll have the halibut in the beurre blanc with Meyer lemon, very light, very simple, no garnish. Ivy's hand froze on the water pitcher, Meyer lemon. It might have meant nothing to anyone else, but Ivy had spent 3 years memorizing every allergen, every dietary restriction, every medical nuance that could affect the people she loved. It was automatic now, coded into her nervous system. Margaret reached out and tugged softly on the sleeve of Juliet's blue gown. She made a low, wordless sound of protest, shaking her head. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. Juliet patted Margaret's hand with a condescension so precise it could have been choreographed. "It's fine, Margaret. I've got it handled. Simon, just the halibut, thank you." Simon bowed and turned to leave, and then Ivy saw it. Margaret's hands resting in her lap, half hidden by the tablecloth. Her fingers moved. It was small, discreet, barely more than a twitch. A person who didn't know ASL would never have noticed. But Ivy knew ASL the way she knew breathing. Margaret had signed 2 words, allergic, citrus. Ivy's vision tunneled. The ambient noise of the restaurant collapsed into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She looked at the retreating back of Simon, heading to the kitchen with an order for halibut in Meyer lemon beurre blanc. She looked at Juliet, who was now sipping her ansere with the calm satisfaction of a woman whose plan was proceeding flawlessly. She looked at Dominic, who was murmuring into his phone about quarterly projections, entirely oblivious. And she looked at Margaret, whose hands had moved again. This time, the sign was unmistakable. Ivy had seen Caleb make it once, in a hospital bed when the morphine wasn't enough. Help! Patrick's voice echoed in her skull. If Dominic Ashworth so much as learns your first name, you're done. Ivy needed this job. She was 11 months behind on the medical debt from Caleb's treatments. The collection agency called every Wednesday, at 9 in the morning like clockwork. Her landlord in Parkdale had already issued a formal warning about late rent. If she was fired from Aurelia, she would be blacklisted in every fine dining establishment in the city. But Margaret's fingers were trembling in her lap. Before Ivy's rational mind could calculate the cost of what she was about to do, her body moved. She stepped into Simon's path just as he cleared the frosted glass partition. Her voice came out thin, barely audible. "Wait!" Simon stopped, his face twisting with irritation. "Ivy, what the hell are you doing, move?" But Ivy didn't move. She turned around and walked back to the table. She set the heavy silver water pitcher down on the white linen. The dull thud was loud enough to fracture the quiet. Dominic lowered his phone. Juliet's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. Ivy stepped directly between Juliet and Margaret. She looked down at the elderly woman. Margaret looked up, startled, confused, and then suddenly, achingly hopeful. Ivy raised her hands. The muscle memory of 25 years surged through her like an electric current. Her fingers, which had trembled with anxiety every day since Caleb's death, became fluid, precise, and certain. Her facial expression softened into the warmth and clarity that ASL demanded, the language of the face as essential as the language of the hands. She signed, "Hello, my name is Ivy. You do not have to eat the halibut. Are you allergic to citrus?" For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Margaret's eyes went wide. Her mouth fell open. She stared at Ivy's hands as though they had reached into a locked room and flung the door open. A sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a sob, raw and involuntary, and devastating in its relief. Then Margaret's hands flew up, tears already spilling, signing back with the speed of someone who had been screaming into a void for months and had finally been heard. Yes, deathly allergic. Lemon, lime, grapefruit, all citrus. She knows. She always knows. She's done this before. Please, please, you have to tell my son. What is happening? Dominic's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. He was on his feet, phone abandoned on the table, his dark eyes locked on Ivy, with an intensity that could have stopped traffic. "She's doing some kind of hand gestures at your mother." Juliet's voice was controlled but tight, a hairline fracture running through the composure. "This is wildly inappropriate. Patrick should be here. This girl is clearly disturbed." Margaret ignored the chaos entirely. She gripped the edge of Ivy's apron with one hand and kept signing with the other, her movements fast, fierce, desperate. "Tell him I am not sick. Tell him my mind is fine. Tell him what she has been doing to me." "I'm going to translate exactly what your mother is saying," Ivy said, looking directly at Dominic. Her voice shook, but it held. "Word for word. She's been trying to tell you something for a long time." Patrick materialized at the edge of the alcove, his face the color of old parchment. "Mr. Ashworth, I am profoundly sorry. This server has no business interfering with your evening. Ivy, you are terminated. Get out of this room immediately." He reached for Ivy's arm. Margaret slammed her open palm on the table. The crack echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Patrick's hand hovered in mid-air. Juliet's wineglass clinked against her rings. Margaret pointed a trembling finger at Patrick, shaking her head with fierce authority. Then she pointed at Ivy and patted the empty chair beside her. The gesture was unmistakable. "Stay." Dominic stared at his mother. He hadn't seen her this animated in over a year. The fire in her eyes was something he recognized from his childhood, from the woman who had built the family's first mining operation in northern Ontario with her bare hands and a geology degree from Queen's, before the stroke had taken her hearing, and, he had believed, much of her sharpness. "My mother wants her to stay," Dominic said quietly. He turned to Ivy. "Everything." Juliet stood up. "Dominic, this is insane. Your mother is confused." Dr. Halton said the cognitive decline would present exactly like this. Paranoia, agitation fixating on strangers. "We should leave." "Now, sit down, Juliet." The 2 words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ivy looked at Margaret and signed, "I am here, I am listening. Tell me everything." Margaret's hands moved with the clarity and precision of a woman whose mind was not failing, had never been failing, and who had been imprisoned inside a lie for the better part of 2 years. Ivy translated, as Margaret signed, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. "Your mother says she is deathly allergic to all citrus. She says Juliet has known this since the incident at the Stratford Festival Gala 2 years ago, when a single drop of lime in a cocktail garnish triggered a severe anaphylactic reaction. Your mother nearly died in the ambulance on the way to Toronto General. Juliet was sitting beside her when it happened. The color drained from Dominic's face. Margaret kept signing. Your mother says she is not suffering from dementia or cognitive decline. She lost her hearing completely after the stroke, but her mind is perfectly intact. She says Juliet has been systematically isolating her, replacing her private nurse every few months, so no one stays long enough to recognize the pattern. intercepting her mail, removing the pen and notepad from her nightstand, confiscating her tablet. Dominic's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. Why? Margaret's hands answered. Ivy swallowed. Your mother says Juliet has been paying Dr. Raymond Holton at Sunnybrook to produce false medical assessments documenting progressive cognitive decline. She says Juliet has been building a legal case to have her declared mentally incompetent. Juliet let out a sharp, brittle laugh. This is absolutely deranged. Dominic, you cannot possibly be taking this seriously. This waitress is putting on a show. She's probably making up signs. Anyone can wave their hands around. But Dominic wasn't looking at Juliet. His eyes were locked on his mother's hands, and even though he couldn't understand the signs, he could read the emotion in her face, the relief, the fury, the desperate, burning need to finally be believed. There's more, Ivy said. Her hands were shaking now, but she kept translating. Your mother says the plan is to have her committed to a long-term psychiatric care facility, Pine Grove, the private facility in Muskoka. By declaring her mentally incompetent, Juliet would gain legal authority over her 35% voting stake in Ashworth Resource Holdings. Your mother says Juliet intends to execute this before the European merger closes. She says the commitment papers are ready. The private dining room was airless. Simon stood frozen against the partition, clutching his order pad. Patrick had backed against the wall, visibly sweating through his dress shirt. Where? Dominic's voice was barely above a whisper. Where are the papers? Margaret signed 3 short, deliberate sentences. Ivy translated. Your mother says they're in Juliet's handbag. The cream Hermes Kelly on the floor beside her chair, interior pocket. Signed commitment forms and the falsified medical evaluation from Dr. Holton. She saw Juliet place them there in the car on the way to the restaurant tonight. Every pair of eyes dropped to the floor beside Juliet's chair, where a cream-colored Hermes Kelly bag sat against the table leg. Juliet lunged for it. Dominic was faster. He moved around the table with a speed that belied his exhaustion, snatching the bag by its handle a half-second before Juliet's fingers closed on air. Dominic, that is my personal property. Juliet's voice cracked, the broadcast polish disintegrating. You have absolutely no right. Dominic opened the clasp. His hand went into the interior zippered pocket. He pulled out a manila envelope, thick and heavy, sealed with the letterhead of a law firm Ivy didn't recognize. Juliet stopped moving. Dominic opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, like a man defusing a bomb. He pulled out a stack of documents. Ivy could see, even from where she stood, the Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center seal on one page and the ornate header of what appeared to be commitment authorization forms on another. Dominic read in silence for nearly 30 seconds. The only sound was the distant clatter of the kitchen and the barely perceptible hum of the ventilation system. Involuntary psychiatric commitment, Dominic read aloud, his voice utterly flat. Transfer of proxy voting rights and fiduciary authority, signed by Dr. Raymond Holton, dated for this Friday. He set the papers on the table. He looked at Juliet. Ivy had seen many expressions in her life. She had watched Caleb's doctors deliver news that could not be softened. She had seen her own face in the mirror the morning after he died. But she had never seen anything quite like the look on Dominic Ashworth's face in that moment. It wasn't rage. It was something colder, something geological, the kind of pressure that forms diamonds or destroys mountains. 3 years, Dominic said softly. You slept in my home. You sat across from my mother at breakfast. You helped her into the car. You held her arm at the charity gala and smiled for the cameras. And you were building a cage around her the entire time. Dominic, listen to me. Juliet's voice broke. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through her foundation. I did it for us. She's a burden. The merger needs clean governance, and she's been an obstacle. The board wanted her shares consolidated. I was protecting the company. I was protecting you. You ordered her a dish with Meyer lemon, Dominic said. Tonight. Knowing she's anaphylactic. You were going to trigger a medical emergency at the dinner table and use it as justification to accelerate the commitment. Juliette opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Get out. The words filled the room like a pressure wave. Dominic, please. I said, get out. His voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was infinitely worse. Leave the ring. Leave the bag. Walk out of this restaurant. My legal team will be in contact with Dr. Halton and with whatever firm prepared these documents. If you attempt to contact my mother, if you come within 500 meters of any Ashworth property, I will personally ensure that the RCMP, the Ontario Securities Commission, and the College of Physicians are all made aware of exactly what you've done. Now leave. Juliette's hands were shaking so violently that it took her 3 attempts to pull the engagement ring from her finger. It was a 5-carat oval diamond, and it dropped onto the wet tablecloth with the muted sound of something irreversible. She turned without looking at anyone and walked out of the alcove. Her heels clicked against the hardwood in a rapid, uneven rhythm that faded into the sounds of the main dining room, and then she was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Dominic stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the doorway. Then, slowly, he turned to his mother. Margaret was crying, but she was smiling. The desperate, hunted look that had defined her face when she walked in was gone, replaced by something luminous and defiant. She opened her arms. Dominic Ashworth, the man who controlled a company valued at $14 billion, who had negotiated with prime ministers and sovereign wealth fund directors, dropped to his knees beside his mother's chair. He buried his face in her lap, his broad shoulders heaving, and Margaret stroked his hair with the gentle, steady hands of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for her son to come home. Ivy stepped back. The water pitcher felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She was an intruder in this moment, and she knew it. She began to retreat toward the service corridor, her apron brushing against the partition. Wait. Dominic's voice was thick. He stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and turned to Ivy. His eyes were red, but something in them had shifted. The exhaustion was still there, but beneath it was a clarity that hadn't been present when he walked in. Patrick stepped forward immediately, his hands clasped in front of him, his face arranged into an expression of servile concern. Mr. Ashworth, I cannot begin to express how sorry Aurelia is for this unprecedented disruption. Ivy is, of course, immediately. Patrick. Dominic didn't look at him. If you finish that sentence, I will have my people acquire this property before the weekend and convert it into a parking garage. Are we understanding each other? Patrick swallowed. Perfectly, sir. Ivy is our most valued team member. Dominic turned back to Ivy. He studied her for a moment, the worn-out black flats, the apron that was slightly too large, the tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite control. My mother had a massive stroke 2 years ago, Dominic said quietly. She lost her hearing completely. I was in the middle of negotiating mining rights in 3 different countries. I told myself I was providing for her by hiring the best medical team money could buy. I let Juliette handle the day-to-day care. I never once stopped to learn my own mother's language. His voice cracked. I left her locked inside her own silence. He glanced back at Margaret, who was watching them with sharp, warm, intelligent eyes. She signed something, pointing directly at Ivy with a small, unmistakable smile. What is she saying? Dominic asked. Ivy felt a real smile cross her face for the first time in 18 months. It felt foreign and fragile and extraordinary, like the first warmth of spring after a brutal Ontario winter. She says I'm a terrible waitress, Ivy translated, because I never brought the bread basket. Dominic laughed. It was sudden, raw, and unguarded, the kind of laugh that comes from a place of overwhelming relief rather than humor. Several diners at nearby tables turned to look. Ivy Renaud, Dominic said, composing himself. I don't know what they're paying you here, but I'll quadruple it. My mother needs an executive liaison, someone who can translate, advocate, and actually listen. My company needs someone with that kind of integrity on the team. Will you consider it? Ivy's eyes stung. She thought about Caleb. About the stack of hospital invoices held together with a rubber band on her kitchen counter. About the scholarship she'd lost, the degree she'd abandoned, the year and a half of suffocating silence she'd wrapped around herself like armor. She thought about the fact that her hands, the same hands that had held Caleb's until they went still, had just unlocked a cage for someone else's mother. She looked at Margaret, who gave her a slow, deliberate nod, the kind of nod that carries the weight of absolute certainty. Yes, Ivy said. Her voice was clear and steady, stronger than it had been in 18 months. I'd be honored. That evening, Ivy Renaud walked out of Aurelia for the last time. She didn't leave through the service entrance, the way she'd arrived every shift for the past 2 years. She walked out through the front door, flanked by Margaret and Dominic Ashworth, stepping into the back of a waiting black sedan that smelled of leather and possibility. The city lights of Toronto blurred past the rain-streaked windows, and Margaret reached over and took Ivy's hand. She squeezed it once firmly, the way Caleb used to do before every doctor's appointment. Then she signed, slowly, so Ivy could see clearly in the passing streetlight. Thank you for hearing me. Ivy signed back, her fingers steady in the dark. Always. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room belongs to someone who never makes a sound. And sometimes, the person brave enough to listen is the one who changes everything.